I think we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation today. My name is John Bessler. I teach here at the law school. I teach courses on human rights and the death penalty and civil procedure and contracts and legal writing. And we're going to have a panel today about the Afghan aftermath and looking at some faculty perspectives on that. So I wanted to give a little context before we start, and then we'll get into our panel discussion, hopefully have some time for some questions as well. The war in Afghanistan began during George W. Bush's administration in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, a day that I think anybody, at least of a certain age, will remember and will never forget what happened that day. The images of the hijacked planes flying into the World Trade Center on the morning of September 11th, the Pentagon on fire, and the story of the passengers of United Flight 93, a flight that crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that was after the passengers, led by Tom Burnett, tried to retake the plane from the hijackers, are ones that we're not going to forget. They're going to be forever etched in our collective consciousness. The coordinated 9/11 terrorist attacks resulted in nearly 3,000 fatalities. And the war in Afghanistan then began on October 7th, 2001, when a U.S.-led coalition seeking to target Osama bin Laden's terrorist organization began attacks on Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. That operation began what became known as the War on Terror, with the war in Afghanistan becoming the longest war in U.S. history. Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan on May 2nd, 2011, on a raid on his compound, but the war in Afghanistan continued long after that raid. In February 2020, Donald Trump's administration signed a peace deal with the Taliban that called for the U.S. to get out of Afghanistan in 14 months. That agreement led to the release of 5,000 prisoners last year, including top Taliban commanders, which strengthened the Taliban vis-a-vis the Afghan government. President Joe Biden ultimately decided to end the war in Afghanistan, as we all know. On August 31st of this year, just recently, after the Afghan government collapsed in literally a matter of days and the Taliban took control of the country, and just a few days after, the terrorist attack outside the Hamid Karzai International Airport had killed 13 U.S. service members, injured many others, and killed at least 169 Afghans. President Joe Biden gave a speech from the White House announcing that the United States had ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan. He said in his speech that the U.S. had completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with more than 120,000 people evacuated to safety, noting the assumption that had been made that the more than 300,000 Afghan national security forces that have been trained over 2 decades would be equipped and would be a strong adversary to fight the Taliban turned out not to be accurate. After a war that claimed more than 2,400 U.S. service members and tens of thousands of Afghan lives, both military and civilian, Major General Chris Donahue, who had been deployed 17 times, including 4 tours in Afghanistan, became the last American soldier to leave Afghanistan when he stepped aboard the C-17 transport plane at the airport. Today, in that context, we put together a program of UB faculty members to discuss the aftermath of the war in Afghanistan, America's longest war. There's a lot of ground to cover, from national security and counterterrorism issues to the plight of Afghan refugees and the future of women and girls in a now Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, to the impact of the war in Afghanistan on veterans, human rights, and the international system. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Chris Stutz at UB and our dean for sponsoring this program and helping to coordinate it, as well as the Government and Military Law Association, the International Law Society, and the International Law Association for co-sponsoring the event. We'll have some time for Q&A, as I mentioned, after the panelists give some remarks and answer a few questions that I'll pose to them. So look forward to that. But before we start, I would like to give a few introductory remarks about each of the, by way of introduction, about each of the panelists. Rob Knowles, who will be our first speaker, teaches national security law, administrative law, and civil procedure. His scholarship explores the ways that the national security state acts as a regulator. Prior to joining UB, he taught at Valparaiso Law School and as an attorney at Covington and Burling represented 16 Yemeni Guantanamo detainees in federal habeas litigation. Nienke Grossman is the co-director of the Center for International Comparative Law. She's currently serving a 3-year term as co-chair of the Women International Law Interest Group of the American Society of International Law. Hugh McClean is the director of the Bob Parsons Veterans Advocacy Clinic, where he teaches, works with students in the representation of veterans. He joined UB in 2016. Prior to that, he was directed the legal writing program at the Department of Law at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado. And Professor Elizabeth Keys is the director of UB's Immigrant Rights Clinic, where she works with students representing immigrants. Prior to that time, she worked at American University's Washington College of Law at the Immigrant Justice Clinic, and she's been very active in the immigration bar. So with that, I'd like to turn first to Rob and ask Rob, what was the basis under U.S. law for the U.S. Waging this war in Afghanistan in the first place?
Thanks, John. So as lawyers or law students, we have to keep in mind that everything that the U.S. government does has to have some source of legal authority, including war. The Constitution vests war powers in both the president and Congress. Congress declares war. It also funds the military, but the president is the commander in chief. It says it right there in Article 2. So what does this mean in terms of how the United States legally can start a war? There are a couple of different ways that are really important. On September 11th, Al-Qaeda launched an attack on the United States, and it was treated as the equivalent of a military attack, like Pearl Harbor. I think that was appropriate. Based on the events of September 11th, the president could have had the power under the Constitution to launch a war in Afghanistan and against the Taliban. Some may quibble with that or dispute that, but I think that it's fairly clear under the Supreme Court's interpretation of the president's powers, what's called the defensive war power. However, regardless, Congress stepped in almost immediately on September 18th, 2001, and enacted a statute which is known as the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, or AUMF, which authorized the president to do the following: to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. And then this is really important: in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. So this is a statute, right? It's not a declaration of war in the traditional sense. The last time that happened was in World War II, right? But Congress nonetheless gave the president a very, very broad power to use force. And so what the president did immediately in response to this, using this authority, was to say to the Taliban, which was the government of Afghanistan at the time, hey, you are harboring Al-Qaeda, give up Al-Qaeda. And the response was no, basically, or silence. And so as a result, the United States attacked Afghanistan. And what's really, really striking all of these years later is how this one statute, the AUMF, has been the authority justified or used or referenced for so many attacks that the United States has conducted, not only in Afghanistan, but throughout the Middle East and in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And the United States continues to wage war against organizations that have some sort of connection, sometimes very tenuous connections, to the Al-Qaeda, which actually launched the September 11th attacks. That Al-Qaeda has been decimated since. It barely exists. It probably doesn't really exist as an entity any longer, but it has franchises, right? Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so the United States uses this authority to justify waging war against those franchises and those other affiliate groups that may share some resemblance or overlap of personnel. So that's my long answer to the question, and I will.
Yeah, one follow-up. During their congressional testimony, two of the top U.S. generals, General Mark Milley and General Frank McKenzie, said that they recommended keeping a force of 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. The decision was made, though, not to leave U.S. troops there. Now that the war in Afghanistan is over, what legal authority does the President of the United States still have, if the President so chooses, to order attacks on the Taliban or any kind of armed terrorist group that might reformulate in Afghanistan? We've already seen the ISIS-K discussion of that as well.
Yeah, so as long as the United States maintained boots on the ground in Afghanistan, it blurred the issue of whether or not the United States, still under this authorization, could be waging war in the region. But now that the United States no longer has boots on the ground, we have to confront more directly whether continued operations are actually authorized by the statute. And I think that it is certainly something that's going to be argued by this administration. But it does call into question whether or not this statutory authority is no longer operative, right? In some sense, or whether or not it should be amended or replaced by new authorization. But yeah, so the United States I think we have to confront this issue. I don't think there's a clear answer. That's my answer.
Okay. Professor Grossman, people around the world are obviously very concerned about the Taliban's violation of human rights of women and minorities and just the general conditions there. I noticed just a couple days ago, there was a story about how the electricity may be going out in the capital of Afghanistan because of the inability to pay money to the energy providers that are there. So the humanitarian issues are obviously really stark. What can the international community do to influence or pressure the Taliban to comply with its own human rights obligations under international law? I don't know, you could talk a little bit about the state of the law in Afghanistan itself at this point, given that there's been this takeover, but what can we do from an international perspective?
Okay, thank you for the question. And let me just say that I was thinking about the fact that the war in Afghanistan spanned my entire career as a lawyer until now. My first week of law school, as I mentioned to my Civ Pro students, I see some of you here, and to my international law students, was 9/11, 2001. I was sitting in civil procedure, and I remember the student who came in, whose name I will never forget, and said, "Did you hear about the planes that hit the World Trade Center?" So that was literally my 1L year. And then now 20 years later, this entire time, there's been a war in Afghanistan. So it's kind of mind-blowing. And as I hope we'll talk about later, it's really had its effect on various different, areas of the law. So going back to Professor Bessler's question, so first of all, it's really important to note that Afghanistan continues to have human rights obligations, regardless of who is in power, who holds the reins of government. Afghanistan is a party to numerous international human rights treaties, including the Convention Against Torture, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which, by the way, Afghanistan became a party in 1980 and was the first Muslim state to become a party to CEDAW with no reservations, which is very unusual. Afghanistan is also a party to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and various other international human rights treaties. A state continues to be bound by its treaty obligations when the government changes, unless the state withdraws from the treaty. So to borrow from a property concept, the treaty obligations run with the land. They don't just disappear because the government changes. In the case of human rights treaties in particular, There's a debate about whether treaty withdrawal is even permissible once a state becomes a party to an international human rights treaty. And then, as my international law students know, aside from human rights treaties, there are other sources of international law which bind states, including customary international law and jus cogens, which hopefully you'll learn about when you take international law. So what can the international community do to get Afghanistan to comply with its obligations under these various treaties and other sources of international law? Well, there are several tools available. There are a number of UN human rights organs and offices that monitor states' human rights records. The UN Human Rights Council, which is a political body composed of representatives from various different UN member states, can keep a close eye on Afghanistan and denounce it when it engages in gross violations of human rights. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights can also do this. There are UN special rapporteurs and UN treaty bodies that are composed of experts that can and already are trying to influence Afghanistan's practices by speaking out against them or by speaking out about them. So, for example, one particularly interesting one was the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women issued a declaration shortly after the Taliban took power about the content of Sharia law and how the Taliban's interpretation was not, the only interpretation under Islam of, how women and girls should be treated. These bodies can pressure and shame the government of Afghanistan, and they can also provide hope to groups within Afghanistan whose rights are threatened. The UN Security Council has the power to issue binding decisions, unlike these other bodies. All the ones I've mentioned, they're not really binding. They don't have, forceful enforcement mechanisms, if you want to put it in those terms. But when it comes to the Security Council, which does have the power to issue binding decisions, there's the veto power, right? There's 5 permanent members of the Security Council that can veto any of the resolutions. And it looks like China, for example, is trying to develop a very good relationship, or at least trying to develop a relationship with Afghanistan. And Russia also has been pressuring around issues of aid and things like that. So it's not clear that the Security Council could actually achieve anything. There's also the International Criminal Court. And so Afghanistan became a party to the International Criminal Court in 2003. So what that means is that the court will have jurisdiction or has jurisdiction over a set of international crimes that are committed within the territory of Afghanistan since that date. Now, this has been very controversial because there's been a lot of talk about prosecuting US citizens for crimes committed on the territory of Afghanistan during the war. But now we're talking about it in relation to potential acts that the Taliban could commit against the people of Afghanistan. So there's a set of crimes, they're war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, which fall within the jurisdiction of the court. And so long as Afghanistan remains a party to the Rome Statute, which established the ICC, the court has jurisdiction. And if the Taliban decides that it wants to withdraw Afghanistan from membership in the International Criminal Court, it has to give at least 1 year of notice. So none of this is entirely satisfying. I hope you got that from this discussion so far. But there is no policeman of the world to force Afghanistan to comply with its obligations, but there are pressure points. And if the Taliban wants Afghanistan to be part of the world community, it needs to participate and engage with these mechanisms to some extent. And I hope, I'll have a chance to talk later about sort of the some of the other pressure points, like when Professor Bessler was referring to electricity and humanitarian needs, there's some room for pressure there as well.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I was just looking for the panel this morning, and the Security Council had passed a resolution back in September renewing the mandate of the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan. This was a story from September 17th, which specifies the importance of equal and meaningful participation of women in public life. I was curious to know, Professor Grossman, what's the issue of the Taliban being recognized as the government of Afghanistan? And what kind of bilateral pressure can states like the United States put on Afghanistan to comply with their obligations?
Great, thank you. So states do have some leverage to pressure Afghanistan to respect human rights because Afghanistan is in desperate need of foreign aid and it wants to be able to access its assets abroad. So there was a New York Times article that was published last week that indicated that the healthcare system in Afghanistan is on the verge of collapse. The World Bank and other international donors froze $600 million in healthcare aid when the Taliban took over. Foreign aid has at times made up 75% of Afghanistan's public expenditures. So the money that the government spends comes from foreign aid, okay? And much of this has been frozen since mid-August. 500,000 Afghans were internally displaced during the Taliban's campaign this summer. There's a drought that threatens the food supply. 18 million Afghans are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, according to the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So there's a lot of discussion right now about conditioning aid on compliance with basic human rights standards, particularly those dealing with women's and girls' rights. And so the question that faces the world community is, how do you get humanitarian aid to Afghanistan without legitimizing the Taliban? And when it comes to recognition, when we talk about recognition of a government, that means formal acknowledgement that a particular group is the government of a state. Okay, so Afghanistan is a country. It's not going to change as being a country or a state under international law because the government changes or because there's upheaval. What we're talking about now is who is the government of Afghanistan. And so usually the decision to recognize a government is based on whether the government has effective control over the territory. Sometimes other elements have come into play as well, but at a minimum, they need to have control over their territory. And there are significant benefits that come with being recognized as the government of a state, benefits that Afghanistan and the Taliban want. For example, when your government is recognized, it means that members of the government have diplomatic immunity, so they can travel without being detained. And perhaps more important, it allows the government access to the state's assets in other countries. So, for example, the US banking system currently holds $10 billion of Afghan money, and they're all frozen pending recognition of the Taliban as the Afghan government. Also, if you're not recognized as the government of a state, you cannot occupy that state's seat at an international organization. And no state has recognized the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan since it took over in mid-August. So interestingly, and I'm wrapping up, I promise, it's not the first time that the Taliban has struggled with issues of recognition. Between 1996 and 2001, when the Taliban was first in power before 9/11, only 3 states recognized the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan: Pakistan, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And the UN General Assembly refused to accept the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan and instead recognized an alliance of Afghan opposition groups. So There's a lot of debate here around, to what extent you want to use these tools as leverage. And this echoes what happened between 1996 and 2001. This debate on whether it's better to engage with Afghanistan, recognize the Taliban, engage with them directly, or whether it's better to isolate the Taliban. Because when it happened in 1996 to 2001, we ended up with 9/11, and that was a policy of isolation. But on the other hand, are you going to recognize a government that engages in horrific practices like the Taliban did between 1996 and 2001? So I'll leave it at that with some thoughts for all of us to consider. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Hugh, let's go to you next. I know that as our resident expert on veterans, and you, we were talking before the program started about all the care that's provided right here in Maryland to veterans. How has the Afghan war and this 2 decades of war affected military veterans?
Well, thanks for the question, John. So my perspective in answering that question is informed by my work in the Veterans Advocacy Clinic, where my students represent veterans in disability benefits cases, as well as discharge upgrade cases. A discharge upgrade case is when a veteran receives a less than honorable discharge and then petitions the service for an upgrade in that discharge characterization to something like an honorable discharge. So that informs a lot of what I've been thinking about Afghanistan from that veteran's perspective. I also was an Air Force JAG for 10 years, and I didn't serve in Afghanistan, but I'll share with you in a moment kind of my perspective that I gained from being in the military. So when I think about the 2 decades of war in Afghanistan's effect on veterans, it's from a disability perspective. So there's lots of ways to measure the costs of war. Certainly many lives lost on both sides. But in our clinic, we see a lot of the disabled veterans that are coming out of the war. And it's interesting to think about veterans and the life of a soldier or a sailor after they leave service. I think that's an interesting idea that is not always contemplated in terms of measuring or weighing risks and benefits of costs of war. I think in the news media and even inside the Pentagon, a lot of the costs of war are weighed in terms of lives lost of active duty soldiers and casualties and injuries of active duty soldiers. It's also probably cost of war might be measured by the Department of Defense's budget. So that would be the planes and the tanks and the submarines that are costs are expended on to build these things and to go to war. But you almost never hear about what's going to happen after those soldiers come home or after the war ends. And I think that's often a miscalculation in terms of not considering all the costs that come along after soldiers return from war. So as I mentioned, I was a JAG in the Air Force, and I worked in the Pentagon for some time. And I think sometimes the public perceives maybe veterans and Department of Defense working together when actually they're two very distinct agencies. And my experience in the Department of Defense was very much focused on the mission at hand, to fight and to win wars. And there was almost never an afterthought to what happens to soldiers and sailors later on. Even when I was separating from the service in 2014, we went through a program that would try to assimilate us into civilian society and teach us resume skills and job hunting. A lot of us had not been out in the workforce for some time. And even then, very little was talked about Veterans Affairs and your benefits. There was almost no mention of it. But I think I understand that that's changed recently. You can now apply for disability benefits even before you leave service, and there's a lot more education by VA. So that's progress. But really, the agencies are totally separate. Department of Defense has almost nothing to do with the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I think those agencies could probably benefit from more collective work. Just to give you some idea of the VA's, the money that the VA expends on disabled soldiers and sailors who are returning. So I think this is one of the things that isn't talked about in Washington, and it's maybe one of the greatest secrets in Washington. So 2001, the Department of Veterans Affairs has a budget prior to 9/11 of $40 billion. 9/11 happens. 8 years later, the budget balloons. It doubles. Okay, VA budget in 2009 goes up to $94 billion from $40 billion. Today, in 2021, the budget is $243 billion. And President Biden, I understand, has asked in his budget proposal for $273 billion. So it continues to climb. It's approximately a 5% or 500% increase today from what it was in 9/11. It's the largest discretionary budget behind the Pentagon. So I think that number is amazing and something to consider, and it's often not regarded, or it's disregarded. And I don't know if that's intentional or not. In some ways, it can be explained. How can it be explained? Well, we didn't really know all the injuries that were going to come out of these wars. The signature war, or the signature injury, for the Afghanistan and Iraqi wars has been traumatic brain injury. That's been heavily researched, but it's still very much misunderstood, and studies are still being done. PTSD, which might be considered another related mental health condition, was only recognized by the VA in 1980. Much research is still being done on PTSD and what causes that and how do we treat it. There's now a center at Walter Reed Medical Center called the National Intrepid Center for Excellence. It's at Walter Reed. It wasn't established until 2010. And there they treat veterans for all kinds of mental health conditions and are doing a lot of research on traumatic brain injury. But the point is that none of those risks were probably known in 2001 before this 20-year period. And so maybe the VA costs just aren't calculated because that's not what Department of Defense thinks about, or maybe it's just we didn't know about all the risks. But nonetheless, there's this increasing, ballooning, out of control budget that's happening in VA, and it certainly should be a calculation going forward. So I'll leave it at that. And
I was looking at, there was a study actually that just came out at the Brown University, the Watson Institute, where they were talking about the long-term costs of U.S. care, and they were saying that more than 40% of veterans of the post 9/11 wars, of course we have Afghanistan and Iraq, are entitled to lifetime disability benefits, and it says that the cost of caring for war veterans rises several decades and peaks actually 30 to 40 years after the conflict, because veterans increase with age and therefore their healthcare needs increase as well. Given that broad scope, and we obviously have the pre-9/11 period, the post-9/11 period, what is the trust level with the military among veterans in terms of getting the benefits and disability, for example, benefits they need? I know there's been a lot of discussion of issues like burn pits and other things as well that people need to get their health care, right, for the wars that they served in.
So the VA is working through a series of problems of getting veterans the care that they need and the disability benefits they need. I mean, I think the trust level in terms of the medical care is very good. Veterans, by and far, are happy with health care, and they like the medical providers that they're using. VA has done some things to try to address providing care to veterans in rural areas. Under the CARES Act, they allow veterans who live a certain distance away from a provider to go to a private provider. So that's an option for veterans. So it's the healthcare is fairly good in terms, and that's impressive because it's a huge medical system, one of the largest medical systems in the United States. And to make sure that it's running properly is a good thing to have. What's not happening is like you said, on the benefit side, getting veterans the disability benefits for injuries from service. That remains to be a problem. VA still hasn't hired enough adjudicators to decide the cases. They've had better luck at the higher appellate levels in the hiring. They actually hired more judges and attorneys to decide some of these cases. They're still having problems on the lower end. Say frontline adjudicators who are deciding the initial claims of veterans. There's a lot of backlog there. VA has recently adopted a new appeals system that we're seeing some benefits from. There's good. There's a positive outlook. I think it's a good new model, and veterans are more happy with it. This new model gives veterans more choices and avenues to appeal their claims. It's a little bit more complicated, and so they do need more assistance from attorneys, student attorneys, and it does give veterans more options. Although it's still too early to tell if VA has really, cracked the nut on their backlog of cases.
Thank you. Professor Keyes, let's move to you, and then we'll be able to open it up to some questions, I think. Why has it been so hard for our allies to, in Afghanistan, and we've all heard about the Afghan translators and people trying to immigrate who helped us or were allies during the war in Afghanistan to have paths to migration?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to talk among all these expert points of view. And I want to start before answering.
That was saying, thank you. Whoops. Thank you. I said something very insightful off mic. It was also my first week of law school, a property class, when 9/11 happened. And while the war is now over, the impact it's had on the immigration system, where I've been practicing my entire legal career, has not yet even begun. And I think that's part of the answer to what went wrong with evacuating our allies. Immigration, many consider to be insubstantial part, an arm of the national security system, not a separate immigration system. And we have known for a long time that our allies, especially interpreters, but others who've assisted U.S. forces in Afghanistan, were at risk precisely because of their association with the U.S. military. It's not a secret, and Congress created a path for those allies to migrate called special immigrant visas. There's many kinds of them, but there's this particular kind for our allies in Afghanistan and previously in Iraq. And so some of you may have seen stories where people had submitted applications 10 and 12 years ago for these special immigrant visas. And in August, we're still waiting for their interview at the consulate in Kabul. And perhaps if you saw those stories, you were shocked. That is par for the immigration course. And so part of the answer is just, this is a system that is utterly broken. And the irony, so it would be similar, people going to consulates in Honduras or Brazil, or maybe not Europe, for reasons I'll get into later. The delay is endemic in the system. But here's the other piece, and this is where it gets circular and especially frustrating. In making immigration a key part of our approach to national security, we've created roadblocks that prevent people who these visas exist for. We created these visas for our allies. Our laws also prevent them from getting the visas. And what I'm speaking of specifically is even if you qualify for a visa in immigration law, you must be what's called admissible to the country. Lots of reasons you might not be admissible. One significant one is if you have any connection to terrorism. That sounds reasonable on the face, but when you look at this provision, and if anybody wants to Google search INA 212A3, you'll see it's a lengthy, almost complete statute within the statute that certainly reaches terrorists who we would not want to be immigrating. But it also includes anybody whose family member, voluntarily or involuntarily, for example, and I'm not exaggerating, made a meal for a terrorist. The case law is so incredibly strict on this point. And again, duress is not an exception. So if somebody was compelled to do something that had material value, however small, for the Taliban in the last 20 years, or an immediate family member did, they're inadmissible. There are waivers, but the system is bogged down. It's very difficult to get waivers in any case. And to get a waiver for a terrorism ground of inadmissibility, you can imagine the pressure on adjudicators to not grant waivers. So we've set up something where we've created the need for our allies to have an escape and effectively also stopped them from availing of the escape route. There are other ways to immigrate besides these visas, but the same admissibility problem exists. We've seen stories of US citizens who did not flee Afghanistan because their spouse or their child was not yet a lawful permanent resident. Again, problems of delay, problems of inadmissibility. And then I'll wrap this piece up by saying there was a case not limited to Afghanistan in scope, but that really illustrates this issue from several years ago, Kerry versus Din. And it essentially, the case just says decisions of consular officers are not reviewable. Okay, so the person at the visa office in Kabul makes a decision. There's no right to appeal. Reasonable minds can disagree or agree. The factual pattern, though, in that case is that there was a US citizen, Mrs. Din, who wanted her husband to migrate, and he was Afghani. And he was caught up by this 212 provision where, without telling him what the accusation was, there was an allegation that he had supported terrorism. And because of that, the visa was denied. Mrs. Din said she had a right, as a marital right, to live with her spouse. And the Supreme Court said, you do have a right to live with your spouse. Mrs. Din, you can go to Afghanistan. And that is the heartlessness of our immigration system. And what we saw in the HK airport in August put lie to the facilness of that Supreme Court decision. Of course you can live together. It doesn't need to be in America. So what we've seen with our allies struggling to get out is a result of really all these different issues coming together in a deeply frustrating way.
Thank you for that. I was reading a story in the Baltimore Sun that talked about how Maryland was going to be taking in about 180 Afghan refugees. Probably people have seen the news stories on television about Afghans at military bases now as well. So I guess this is kind of a two-part question. One, what lies in store for the people that have been evacuated from Afghanistan at this point? And then secondly, for people that are still there in the queue to migrate, what happens with them? Okay,
I'll be as brief as I possibly can. And I think it has gone up. We're going to be taking in 1,300 by the end. It's out of an estimate of 53,000 Afghan refugees here. So in Maryland, about 1,300. They are being screened on military bases currently. Usually that happens before they arrive here because of the exigent circumstances. That screening is now happening while physically present in the United States. Once somebody is given refugee status, they have 8 months of benefits, 8 months only, which would include food stamps and housing. Lutheran Immigrant, LIRS, Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services, headquartered here in Baltimore, is a leader in this work, and they are already sending out the alarm that there is not going to be housing sufficient for the refugees. So there's very practical challenges about accessing benefits, accessing housing. I'm more concerned about what happens when the compassionate moment turns. In August, we saw largely an excellent side of America wanting to reach out and bring in people from outside, which is something that's been somewhat rare in the last 20 years. That moment is already seeding and being contested. So outside different military bases, communities are split between running aid drives and getting toys in for the kids on the base and people protesting our country is full. And we're notoriously bad at distinguishing who is Afghan versus anybody else. People may remember the incredible instance of anti-Sikh violence following 9/11, which of course had nothing to do with the Sikh religion. But we're not good at identifying the other. And so I do worry that the Afghan refugees are going to inherit decades of anti-Islam and racially motivated animus once this initial compassionate impulse recedes. And I'm sorry to be so depressing. And for those left behind, the State Department is urging them to find their way to consulates in neighboring countries if they can, to continue the process of getting these special immigrant visas. And of course, anybody at a land border can always seek refugee status in that country. So Pakistan is a destination some of the people who were not able to escape are trying to get to so that they can find safety in a neighboring country.
Thank you. Well, at this point, why don't we open up for questions if people have questions for the panel? Yes. Maybe Nienke, Professor Grossman, would like to say a word about.
Thanks, Professor Bessler.
If there's any discussion in terms of recognition of the Taliban, you said there's not been today around the world. As you look around the world, what do you anticipate might happen there?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Amy, for your question, and also say that it's really nice to see everybody here. And it's been amazing to see students that I only saw in a Zoom box in person, and they're frequently much taller than I am. So first of all, on your point on having an Afghan voice, which we talked about in our international law course, I think it's extremely important. And I want people to know that we tried to do that and it didn't work out. And this is the continuation of a series of sort of faculty perspectives events. And we thought it was worthwhile to share those. And we're hoping to be able to do more of that in the future. Potential, I don't know if I'm allowed to. Okay. We're hoping to possibly, with the University of Maryland, sponsor an Afghan legal scholar who would spend some time here and would be able to speak, hopefully, to our community. But I wanted to thank you for raising that and for you to know that we have been thinking about it. So the rest of your question covered many different areas. And I think one aspect of your question, which I find really interesting, is will the U.S. be able to learn from this going forward? And what will the U.S. learn from this going forward? And I think we're still very much trying to figure that out. You know, what are the lessons to be learned from this 20-year conflict? And I mean, when you think about the decision to withdraw and the circumstances and the billions of dollars that were spent, I think it's a really complicated question that there's not an easy answer to. I do think that the war in Afghanistan in many ways left the United States in a worse position internationally. If you think about within international law, you know, the U.S. defended its use of torture. We have not prosecuted people in the United States for torture committed in Afghanistan. We have been very aggressive against the International Criminal Court, which wants to investigate or considered investigating and prosecuting service members of the United States who engaged in torture. And we've lost a lot of moral authority, you know, in the world. I don't think the war in Afghanistan was good for international law. It sort of undermines some of the basic ideas about human rights. At the same time, if you lived through 9/11, it was a crazy moment in our country. And it was, I mean, I remember my mom was on an airplane stuck coming from Europe and had to take a train from Canada. Somebody else told me about how they saw the Pentagon burning. My civil procedure professor's father was a lawyer who worked in the Twin Towers. So it was a very emotional and sort of world-changing moment. And I think we responded in ways that were negative and positive in light of the information that we had. And there's still learning to be done. So I don't think I answered most of your questions or maybe even any of them, but those are some thoughts. Maybe my colleagues have something to add.
One question you asked, which really keeps me up at night, is could we have done it the right way? And I don't know. So I imagine that there was a moment where we were in the strongest position in Afghanistan. And we could have pursued Osama bin Laden. We could have decimated Al-Qaeda at that point. And instead, what we chose to do is to commit to a long-term occupation of the country and to invade Iraq at the same time. And those two decisions were, disastrous on so many dimensions. At the same time that we began to change the structure of our government to make immigration part of the national security apparatus. So not to be depressing, but I think we did miss an opportunity where we could have at least had a chance to establish a credible government early on. But after those decisions were made, I don't think that it was possible. And I think I see a lot of parallels with the Vietnam War, where it was not possible for us, to set up a credible government that would have legitimacy internally in the country.
Other questions? Sure.
So maybe one of the lessons of the war in Afghanistan is that nation building doesn't work. I mean, I think it's unfair to say that the U.S. did not try to engage in nation building in Afghanistan. I mean, at least for the first several years of the war, it was all about building schools and writing a constitution where women were equal in Afghanistan and getting them to, be part of the world community again. And I think there were a lot of quote unquote positive attempts. Now, maybe that's spoken from a Western liberal democratic mindset, right? But one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, does nation building work, and what would have worked better? I mean, I don't think the U.S. had a choice after 9/11 about whether to invade Afghanistan or not. There were 5,000 people killed in the U.S. So the question now is, how are we going to protect our national security interests when you're reading articles in the newspaper that say that former members of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are moving back to Afghanistan, and they won, they beat the United States. So I would be surprised if the U.S. doesn't have future interventions in Afghanistan if the Taliban continues to be in power and allows, terrorist groups to thrive. We'll have to see. I think it's a real catch-22.
One piece before
microphone. Before I came to law school, I had a career in international development. And one thing that's always frustrated me as a lawyer is the extent to which we silo ourselves from entire areas of expertise. We know how to do international development work, but partly in response to 9/11, the agency with that expertise became subsumed in the Department of State, which has different objectives, sometimes harmonious, but sometimes not. And certainly, the military, for very understandable, justifiable reasons, was the dominant sort of agenda setter of this. And so it was a couple levels down before the people with actual knowledge of how to do this right entered in. And until we have the humility to realize that sometimes answers lie outside our profession, which is something lawyers in general have a hard time with, but for different reasons in the Afghanistan context, we needed that humility and we didn't have it. And so I agree with your assessment that at least as framed as a military objective, nation building wasn't going to work. But there are people, and there's a lot of those organizations headquartered here in Baltimore with that expertise. And I just hope that we listen in the future.
We have one more question back here we can take.
I'll start since I've been very depressing so far. I have nothing concrete, but I've learned enough in life that to appreciate, and this is going to be deeply frustrating, I think, as an answer, but to appreciate serendipity. For 20 years, women and girls had opportunities they would not otherwise have had without your service. And I should have started, and I know it's trite, and I apologize for that, but thank you. And thank you for bringing your voice to this conversation. What you did in Afghanistan gave space for things to happen that otherwise would not have happened. We are not at a point yet in time to see what that will be. But I think about, and I realize she's from Pakistan and not Afghanistan, but Malala Yousafzai, when given a chance, my God, she changed the world. We don't know yet, but I'm optimistic something will come from this. And I'm also hopeful that as the dust settles and people think about what could have gone differently, there will be improvements in how we respond to similar crises in the future. That's what I have.
With that, I think we're at our time limit here, and would like to thank the panel and thank all the people for attending. So thank you very much.